I kind of come out, let them all know. Okay. Yeah, whatever you're up. You guys okay in the back? Can you hear me? Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? You guys can hear me well in the back? Is it just the speaker I can't hear? It's okay through the cameras? Thanks. Jeff Berman will be speaking first.
Hang on 1 second.
Susan Bodine couldn't make it. She's stuck on the tarmac in Washington. So it'll be Paul Compton, General Counsel of HUD. Paul Compton? Yes. And Eric Schaff, Regional Director of HUD. SCHAAF.
And who's he with, sir?
Yeah.
And who's give us the rundown from the beginning? What's the order?
Berman, Compton, Schaff.
Paul Compton, C.
Paul Compton Jr., General Counsel of HUD.
And forget the third one was
Eric Schaff,
ERIC.
SCHAAF.
And he's the regional director of
HUD. Oh, EPA, excuse me.
EPA.
Regional Counsel of the EPA. Paul Compton. Compton, C-O-M-P-T-O-N, Jr. You guys can talk amongst yourselves.
SCHAA.
Still have about 5 minutes. Okay, 2 minutes.
Yeah, we're being quiet. Excellent. How about that? You'll take that live too. That'll be
Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Berman, U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Today, we announce a settlement to ensure that the old ways of doing business at night. This settlement between this office, the City of New York, and the New York City Housing Authority, or NYCHA, is unprecedented and will profoundly improve the living conditions of over 400,000 NYCHA residents. For too long, these residents have had to put up with conditions that are indecent, unsafe, and unsanitary. They have to live in apartments with peeling lead paint, out-of-control mold, heat that doesn't work in the winter, elevators that are broken, and infestation of pests. Today marks the beginning of the end of this nightmare for NYCHA residents. There are two main aspects to the settlement, which is subject to the review and approval by the District Court. First, a federal monitor will be appointed. That monitor will have the mandate and authority to reform NYCHA and fix these problems. And second, the monitor will have the funds to fix these problems, $4 billion in the first 4 years alone. This includes $1.2 billion of city funds budgeted or projected for NYCHA that are now under this agreement locked in. It includes an additional $1 billion of city funds for capital improvements in the first 4 years. Also, there's HUD's annual capital contribution to NYCHA, which is approximately $300 million per year over 4 years. That's $1.2 billion. And there is the state capital funds of $550 million that we anticipate receiving. This all adds up to $4 billion in capital improvements in the first 4 years, all coordinated and directed by a federal monitor. This is an extraordinary commitment by the city that promises real relief for NYCHA residents. And this is not just a short-term solution that kicks the can down the road. After the first 4 years, the city has committed to providing $336 million a year in capital funding through 2027. And thereafter, the city has committed to an additional $200 million per year in capital contributions to NYCHA until these problems are fixed. This commitment by the city is indefinite. And when I say indefinite, I mean just that. The city has committed to pay $200 million a year until these violations are eliminated. Now, let me explain why this far-reaching settlement is necessary. Lead paint. There are over 51,000 apartments at NYCHA that have lead paint. And over a period of several years, NYCHA never inspected those apartments for dangerous situations, never inspected those apartments annually as they were required to do by federal law to ensure that there was no lead paint peeling or deteriorating. NYCHA put thousands of NYCHA families at risk. From 2010 to 2017, at least 19 children contracted lead poisoning. As you know, lead poisoning is extremely serious and can lead to permanent neurological damage. And I should add that every one of these years that NYCHA did not inspect these lead paint apartments, and every one of these years that NYCHA put at risk thousands of its residents, NYCHA falsely certified to HUD that it was conducting these inspections. Mold. In 2016, there were over 28,000 complaints about mold in NYCHA's apartments. 60% of the mold complaints involved mold that covered more than 10 square feet. Mold can exacerbate breathing conditions such as asthma because it releases toxins into the air. Heat. More than 320,000 residents lost heat this past winter. That's 80% of NYCHA's residents. 80% of NYCHA's residents had to freeze in their apartments this past winter. And what's worse, the lack of heat can drive some residents to unsafe self-help remedies, such as turning their ovens on and opening the oven door, or heating water on a stove to heat the apartments. Elevators. Almost 40% of NYCHA residents live in buildings where an elevator was out of service more than 20 times in 2016. And when the elevators are broken, it's difficult for residents because they have to walk up and down several flights of stairs. But it creates an impossibility for the residents who can't walk up those flights of stairs. For the elderly and the disabled, when the elevators are broken, they are trapped in their apartments or they're stranded in the lobbies, sometimes overnight. It's outrageous. Pests and vermin. From 2010 to 2016, NYCHA recorded over 70,000 complaints per year about mice, rodents, and pests. 70,000 complaints per year. And as we all know, rats and other vermin can carry dozens of diseases that are very serious and can harm NYCHA's residents. These conditions are an assault. They're an assault on the health, safety, and dignity of hardworking and rent-paying NYCHA residents. And these violations will no longer be tolerated. And as is often the case, where there are violations, there is a cover-up. Year after year, NYCHA falsely certified that it was in compliance with lead paint regulations when it was not. At the same time NYCHA was issuing its false certifications, it would also use every trick in the book to conceal building violations from HUD inspectors. For example, NYCHA staff would shut off a building's water supply just before an inspection so that the inspector would not see leaks. In another instance, a maintenance worker put a refrigerator motor inside an inoperable roof fan in order to fool an inspector into thinking that the ventilation system was functioning. This NYCHA culture of false certifications and outright deception ends today. The settlement sends a message to those who have unfairly endured substandard conditions for too long. Your voices are being heard. We will not waver as we work to ensure that all NYCHA residents live in decent, safe, and sanitary housing, which is their federal right. I want to thank HUD, represented here today by Paul Compton, HUD's General Counsel, and Lynn Patton, HUD's Regional Administrator. HUD's Office of Inspector General, represented here today by Christina Scaringi. The EPA, represented here today by Eric Schaff, EPA's Region 2 Counsel, and by Chris Lyon, EPA's Regional Chief of Staff. I also want to thank Mark Peters and the New York Department of Investigation for its assistance. I also want to acknowledge the role of the press in extensively investigating and reporting on these issues. And last but not least, I want to recognize the tireless efforts of the career attorneys in our office's Civil Division, whose work is embodied in the settlement we announced today. Assistant United States Attorneys Rob Yalen, Monica Fulch, Cy Mohan, Jacob Lillywhite, and Talia Kramer. And I also want to recognize the Chief of the Civil Division, Jeff Ostrager. I'd now like to introduce Paul Compton, HUD General Counsel.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. Berman, for those remarks. And we wholeheartedly agree with your assessment of the issues at the New York City Housing Authority and applaud your efforts and those of other federal officials inside and outside of the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development over the course of a number of years to uncover issues at NYCHA, those that NYCHA sought to hide. But today, we can open a new chapter as we announce this unprecedented agreement, really a first of its kind in HUD's history, involving the nation's largest public housing authority. And it reflects all too rare cooperation in this type of matter. President Harry Truman said, "It's amazing what can be accomplished if you don't care who gets the credit." Still, I would be remiss if I didn't give credit where credit was due. HUD's Office of the Inspector General helped with a lot of the legwork, much needed elbow grease during the investigative phase, working side by side with U.S. attorneys from the Southern District, especially Rob Yalen and Monica Fulch. HUD's Regional Administrator, Lynn Patton, who is with me today, provided necessary leadership and advocacy and was supported by Luigi Diancona, who serves as our Regional Public Housing Director and who has been a steady and experienced presence throughout this process. And many others were behind the scenes at HUD, especially in the Office of Public and Indian Housing, headed by Dominique Bloom in Washington, and the HUD lawyers and program enforcement staff who I have the privilege to manage, especially Dave Wall, Dane Narode, Brian Dupre, Jennifer Grimm, and Laura Scott. As I mentioned, never before have federal, state, and local officials come together in such a decisive, coordinated, and collaborative way to address inadequate and, quite frankly, deplorable living conditions being endured by hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers who depend on NYCHA for a home. The resolution we announced today is due in part to the Governor's commitment to spend $550 million in state resources to assist NYCHA, and the city, which has made clear both its financial and managerial commitment to resolve problems, and like the Governor, a desire for regulatory relief and labor flexibility. The city came to the table with a commitment to do the right thing and to commit at least $1.2 billion in additional funding to improve the living conditions at NYCHA. So often, the first step to a solution is acknowledging you have a problem. In the consent order filed today, NYCHA acknowledged widespread violation of lead-based paint and other statutory and regulatory requirements. HUD supports more than 3,000 public housing authorities across the nation, none larger than NYCHA. But this is not about big numbers. This is about small children who are at the greatest risk of lead poisoning, asthma, and other home health hazards. No one is more passionate about the health of children than HUD Secretary Ben Carson, who was a pediatric neurosurgeon for many years. But regardless of whether you're the smallest housing authority or the largest, federal law requires that housing that's supported by taxpayers be decent, safe, and healthy. And you can't be healthy if your home is sick. June is National Healthy Homes Month. It's a time HUD makes the clear and close and undeniable connection between health and housing. Secretary Carson has made addressing the dangers of lead-based paint a priority at HUD. This resolution with NYCHA is the type of result we intend to obtain in other enforcement actions where public housing authorities and other landlords don't meet their obligation to provide their residents with decent, safe, and healthy homes. Today, we open a new chapter at NYCHA, one that prioritizes the health of residents and their children in critically needed affordable housing in one of the country's costliest housing markets. In the end, this agreement is a win for everyone, most especially the families living in New York City public housing, and in the long run, taxpayers. HUD looks forward to continuing to work with NYCHA and other housing providers to clear obstacles to good housing choices for all Americans. Again, Mr. Berman and all of the other federal, state, and local officials who have participated, thank you for your contributions in getting us to this big win for the public.
Thanks very much, Paul. And now Eric Schaff, EPA's Region 2 Counsel, would like to say a few words.
Thank you, United States Attorney Berman, for inviting EPA to speak here today and for partnering with the EPA and HUD on this critically important settlement that will protect people in New York City's public housing. And congratulations, General Counsel Compton, for the excellent work by HUD on this settlement. As Mr. Berman indicated, I am Eric Schaff, EPA Region 2's Regional Counsel. Susan Bodine, our Assistant Administrator for Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, planned to speak for EPA today, but unfortunately, her plane was delayed and she sends her regrets. I want to thank the entire case team for their tremendous work in achieving this settlement. Because of them, children living in public housing in New York City will have safer homes. The most common cause of lead poisoning in children is exposure to deteriorated lead paint. Children can be poisoned when they put peeling lead paint flakes in their mouths or ingest lead paint dust. But lead poisoning is entirely preventable. The key is stopping children from coming into contact with lead. That is what EPA and HUD's lead paint regulations are designed to do. These regulations require landlords and renovators to take steps to notify people about lead hazards, to use safe practices when renovating lead paint, and to ensure only certified and trained individuals conduct those renovations. But instead of protecting children, the New York City Housing Authority systematically avoided compliance with lead paint regulations and even lied about it. Today's settlement puts a stop to this behavior. As a result, New York City public housing will be a safer place to live. This settlement also puts landlords, renovators, and realtors across the country on notice. Putting children at risk will not be tolerated. Administrator Pruitt has made reducing children's exposure to lead a priority. The agency is taking action to reduce lead exposures from water, soil, and paint. For example, last year, EPA completed 127 federal enforcement actions against renovation contractors, landlords, and property managers for non-compliance with regulations that require them to protect communities and the public from exposures to lead. Earlier this year, Administrator Pruitt, Secretary Carson, and other members of the President's Task Force on Environmental Health Risks and Safety Risks to Children agreed to partner with each other to develop and implement a federal strategy to reduce childhood lead exposure and associated health effects. Today's settlement is a terrific example of what can be achieved by these partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. We'll take your questions. Yes.
We're live on Facebook, Monica with 11. For 6 months, we've been telling the stories of families who've been suffering. They have 2 questions for you. What took so long, and why? Where's the criminal charges? Because a landlord that would do this, any private landlord would face criminal charges. Is the mayor not going to face criminal charges? Is Shola, the chair, not going to face criminal charges? What can you tell us for our beginning?
Well, the extent of the conditions, it was extensive. It involves 400,000 residents, 175,000 apartments, and we were dealing with NYCHA, which had filed false certifications and was engaged in deception. So it takes a long time. It was a massive investigation, and that's why it took as long as it did. With respect to criminal charges, I have no comment. Yes.
The consent decree has one very interesting paragraph in which you guys agree that there will be no criminal complaint filed against the authority as an entity. However, it leaves open the possibility of criminal charges against individuals. How did you reach that paragraph? What did you discuss to come up with that paragraph?
Well, we weren't going to accept any limitation on the U.S. Attorney's Office ability to pursue criminal charges against individuals. That's how that came about. And when an entity like NYCHA enters into a consent decree like this is, it's inconsistent to bring a criminal charge. The object is to reform NYCHA, not to bring a criminal charge against NYCHA, but we've left open, we have complete flexibility with respect to criminal investigation and charges for individuals. Yes.
As you know, NYCHA is a series of federally subsidized developments, and there has been a significant loss in federal funding over the years. Since 2001, $1.4 billion in operating, $1.4 billion in capital. Why is there no commitment from the federal government to increase its funding, considering that NYCHA was built under a succession of administrations, both Democrat and Republican, who saw the need and utility in building?
Let me first note that these problems exist, these conditions exist, not because of any loss of federal funding, but because NYCHA was a dysfunctional operation and is fundamentally flawed and engaged in a culture of false statements and concealment. And that's recognized today. Even the city and NYCHA itself recognizes its own failings because they agreed to the appointment of a federal monitor with broad powers. With respect to the other question, let Paul speak to that.
There are thousands of public housing authorities across America that every day face budget and other challenges, managerial and otherwise, and they nonetheless meet their obligations. In this case, as Mr. Berman said, this is something that is about failures in the management at NYCHA, and that is our first focus in terms of what we're seeking to fix here.
Can I ask one follow-up to that, Mr. Compton? Do you suggest that the city, as it's kind of flirted with doing for the last number of years, start more privatization of its facilities, selling off land? Because the $2 billion will certainly help, but NYCHA alone says that it needs $25 billion. I mean, it might remediate a number of molds, but there might be another structural issue, in a few years.
The Department of Housing and Urban Development offers public housing authorities a number of innovative alternatives in ways that they can help rebuild an aging stock across the nation of public housing. And unfortunately, NYCHA to date has, in comparison to many other housing authorities, not taken advantage of that. We are encouraged through the discussions that we have had recently with both NYCHA and the city that they will look at more innovative approaches that would, for instance, involve the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, which is the single largest program that helps rebuild and reconstruct high-quality public housing.
Yes.
Mr. Berman, in your proposal, in the agreement, you detail 10 years of a scam, I guess you call it. The agency had a quick fix tips, where they would find a way to pull the wool over inspectors in all manner of shapes and sizes and ways. My question to you is this: how were they able to get away with it for so long? How was it acceptable, and who was to blame for that?
Well, the culture at NYCHA is to blame. The management of NYCHA is to blame. Now, I note that NYCHA has new top management, and we are hopeful that with that top management and the federal monitor and the funds that are available, that they're going to be able to right the ship. But that's where the fault lies, and it was only through our investigation that we came upon that type of deception of inspectors. That was through the hard work of our civil division. Outrageous. I was outraged. My blood was boiling.
I have two questions. First of all, can you talk about why the complaint and the consent decree are being submitted on the same day? Is that a common practice? And then, just to clarify, does this supersede the emergency management position that the governor created?
On the first issue, yes, it is customary where you reach a settlement in a proposed civil action complaint that the complaint and the settlement are submitted on the same day. And with respect to the executive order, we believe that, and we expect and are hopeful that the governor will amend the executive order in a way to make it compatible with this consent decree and not duplicative with the consent decree. So, for example, now that we're going to have a federal monitor in place, I don't know whether it's necessary to have a state manager in place. Thank you very much.
One more question.